Hello, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 43. Today's episode is going to be a little bit atypical, so we usually aim for a mixture of topics and to get to sort of older questions before the most recent ones. Today will be an exception in both regards, in that we will be solely focusing on Syria, newly liberated after more than 50 years of dictatorship by the Assad family, and a series of related questions submitted this week from people in Syria. Thus, our first question is from Moaz, who says, can you discuss the psychology of doctor dictators?
Well, Dr. Dictators. This is in reference, I assume, to Bashar al-Assad, who was the dictator overthrown in Syria about a week ago. And he's a physician. And this raises one of those great questions that educators waste a lot of time on, which is the purpose of education to teach you good morals or like a good vocabulary? And what you wind up seeing is there's all sorts of cases where we have highly educated, highly credentialed, highly competent people whose morals turn out to be somewhat wanting. Two examples come to mind immediately, both of them Dr. K from Harvard, and that gives us Dr. Henry Kissinger or Dr. Ted Kaczynski. And, in some ways, maybe you should just settle for, like, if a good education gets you someone who knows how to use semicolons rather than good morals. The specific thing brought up here is in that realm of doctors. Doctors, they take the Hippocratic oath. Doctors are supposed to save people, not drop poison gas on towns full of civilians, as our ex-president did. So what about doctors? And this part of this mythic picture, of course, with the Hippocratic oath, they will sacrifice anything, they will doctor anyone, no matter who they are. And the reality is, being a doctor for most people is a rather pragmatic profession. I've seen lots and lots of my students head on in that direction. And you know, you want to do some good, that's a good thing. It's also interesting. If you were good at science, you can put those skills to use there. You have a living that is somewhat assured, you're respected, all of that. So yeah, why not go be a doctor? And then every now and then things change so that you have to really pay attention to that Hippocratic oath and decide, are you willing to, for example, endanger your life in the name of being a doctor, as we saw with all those healthcare professionals when COVID hit, and some of them paid for it with their lives. But what you mostly see is, it's great if it lives up to the mythic level. But then, of course, there's the other extreme of the doctors whose hands are soiled with blood. And of course, the example that comes to mind immediately is Dr. Mengele of the Nazis, who did human experimentation. Then, of course, there were the swell docs who did the Tuskegee studies during the occupation of China by Japan. Doctors there, Japanese army doctors, did all sorts of unspeakable medical experiments on captive Chinese and such. So we got the range of doctors for better or worse, which brings us to Bashar and trying to make sense of how this nice doctor wound up being this savagely murderous butcher, which is what he became. And we've got one of those, someone is the end product of everything that led them up to that moment. And he had a trajectory that I think makes perfect sense as to how he wound up this way. He was 5 years old when his father became dictator of Syria. So he grew up surrounded by palace intrigue and corruption and violence and all of that. He was not the firstborn son. He had a big brother. So he was the second born. He was down on the hierarchy there. It was the big brother who was handsome and a jock and a roustabout and had a distinctive chin sticking out, whereas Bashar has like no chin at all. It's receding, and the big brother was the heir apparent, and he was the swashbuckler amongst them, and Bashar was like the younger son. And to invoke the picture that Prince Harry has done, he was not the heir, he was the spare. And reflecting him just being the spare, he decided to become a doctor. A doctor. Okay, he could have been, with like Navy SEAL Rangers doing heart transplants out in the middle of battlefields and stuff. No, he's an eye doctor. He winds up being an eye doctor. Everyone who knows him and meets him, they always use the same word. He's a total geek. He's awkward. He's neurotic. He's got this receding chin. He's basically silent, all of that. And he's just going about his business, becoming a doctor when Big Brother gets himself killed in a car accident, driving his sports car down a road in Damascus at 150 miles an hour. And oops, he hit something. No seatbelt, of course. And that's it for Big Brother. Ironic piece of that, and that's sort of the scenario one might be accustomed to. In this case, the brother was the one driving the car, and weirdly, the chauffeur was sitting in the back and survived just fine, but Big Brother did not. And suddenly, Bashar is no longer the spare. He's supposed to become the heir, and it's clear to him and everybody is, oh my God, this geek, this twerp, this deeb is now supposed to become his dictator, ruthless murderer father's, you know, inheriting the kingdom sort of thing. And everyone kind of panicked, and he himself did, apparently. And it was just decided they needed to puff him up and generate a whole cult of personality around him. Soon they were strutting him around in military uniforms and sticking all sorts of asinine Boy Scout medals all over him to make him look manly and tough. And apparently he did some very feeble attempts at reform when he finally like inherited the place after his father died. And like the West's big hope for him as a reformist was apparently he liked like Western pop music a little bit. So, ooh, we've got another Gandhi on our hands here. But that quickly derailed, and he kind of decided he liked this cult of personality. And always over the shoulder was, I'm not my big brother, that jock, athlete, handsome, soon to be murderer who unfortunately didn't make. I'm not my father, his father who survives one assassination attempt where I think sort of as the myth goes, the father kicked a grenade away from him in the process, like heroic father, heroic brother. And here's poor nebbish Bashar, who's now the dictator of Syria, and he just had a lot to prove. And when you put someone in a position of power like that, who's got a lot emotionally to prove, you see an outcome like this. And it was particularly easy in this case because all the people lined up against him were thems in us them dichotomies. The thing about the Assad family is they're Shiite from this small sect, the Alawites, and they were running all of Sunni Syria. So basically, your average Syrian was a potential enemy, was a them. And before you knew it, it was terribly easy for him to be this murderous monster who killed tens of thousands of Syrian civilians, some with chemical weapons. So in some ways, that was how he was going to turn out. The second the brother hit over 149 miles an hour in the car, that's sort of the next 20 years of Syria's misery that was guaranteed in terms of this guy coming to the throne.
So next, Lue says, what is the scientific explanation of the people who do systematic and long-term torture practices in prisons? And what is their moral judgment if we adopt the determinism perspective?
Well, a very apt question for someone in newly liberated Syria with a state prison there full of the remnants of humans and the guards who guarded the place. And what do we do with them now? Obviously, if you buy my rant about there being no such thing as free will, there's no such thing as blame or praise or reward or punishment or any of these. And Dr. Bashar wound up being who he was because of circumstances that were not in his control. And any of these people wound up exactly the same. You can't blame them. You can't blame them. There's no free will, blah, blah, all of that. Nonetheless, you got to conduct a society in which people are protected from people who, through no fault of their own, wound up being monstrous. And, the conventional thing that's sort of brought out by people like me is to cite quarantine models. No, you don't allow like people to run around on the streets who are dangerous. Instead, you constrain them. You constrain them so they can no longer harm anyone with all these caveats. Once you've accomplished that, you do not constrain them 1 inch further in the name of retribution, in the name of justice being served, in the name of punishment being a moral worth on its own. Next, you don't go in and preach to them each day. Next, you try to figure out what are the circumstances that create people like that. And we see like a little bit of an approximation of that in Norway. Anders Breivik, he was the biggest mass murderer in Norway's history. He was the white supremacist who went and gunned down 70 odd teenagers at a progressive like summer camp on an island outside of Oslo, and who spent all of his trial giving like faux Nazi salutes in there. And he was given the longest prison sentence in the history of Norway, which, when you look at the fine print on it, means he probably is going to be in prison for the rest of his life. And he is in prison in Norway, which means he essentially has an apartment. He has a workout room. He's got a computer. He's a college student. He's a remote college student, political science, I believe, which seemed kind of ironic. And I remember reading the rector of the university when people were saying, this is not for him. This is for us. This is for reifying our national values, that even someone like that from his jail cell can be a student. Breivik, even one year, he entered the gingerbread house making contest among the various inmates there. It is unclear if he won or not. And he's there. And at one point, he said he was getting a little stir crazy and bored, and retired police would come in to play cards with him and talk with him, as long as it wasn't about politics or whatever. This is what they did with him. And this was unrecognizable to most Western countries that couldn't believe that this went on, starting off with the prosecutor shaking his hand on the first morning of the trial there. And this even included, like at one point, the mayor of Oslo, who was a graduate of that summer camp years earlier. The mayor of Oslo sends him a letter and addresses him by his first name, Anders. I am with you. I am with you with empathy in understanding how it is you were turned into who you are. Other than that, we have nothing in common. Like right there is the statement. Sure, have your workout machine, have your like Game Boy or whatever people are using in this century or whatever, and just keep this guy off the street. And what was the most remarkable thing is that most people in Norway were perfectly happy with this as the solution. The fact that this was the longest, most severe sentence that their society was willing to met out to anyone was showing just how much the pain of this was being sort of considered. And most people pronounce themselves, including family members of some of the ones killed, as being content with it. And along the lines of, we don't have to think about this guy anymore. He is just away there forever. Breivik, who is this narcissistic, mediocre non-entity who had just failed at everything he ever went near and found a way of blaming the world for every one of those failures, at some point stumbled into his like band of white supremacist troglodytes who decided that he was wonderful and elevated him. And he dressed up. He played dress up. He made a uniform for himself with fake medals on it and took pictures of himself as a knight of the white supremacist army that was going to liberate Europeans. And the guy was like a pathetic, broken clown. And at the end, that was the attitude of most of the people in Norway, saying this mediocre nothing is locked up and we never have to think about him again. And he's gone. And that was sort of the individual response. Nonetheless, admit that that was not an approach which said there's no such thing as free will. It's one that simply said this is what we do with people like this. There was still an element of blame in it, despite what the mayor of Oslo said. Same question then on, on a societal level. What is a society supposed to do with huge numbers of people who were in the army in Syria just now, things of that sort. What do you do with them? And I think our best example is what was done in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela setting up the first of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which have now been modeled lots of other places in Rwanda and the Balkans, other places, setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a wonderful book by this Italian legal scholar, Andrea Lolini, who was the observer in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think for the International Court of Justice, wrote a book about the whole thing. And immediately what it is perpetrators, killers, murderers of apartheid were supposed to come forward in court, and the family members of their victims would be there, and they would say what they had done. And immediately there's this heartwarming scenario that you're expecting with, before it's over with, these are going to be hardened killers who are sobbing up in the chair. They're apologizing for what I did to your son. And old, elderly, broken mom is hugging him with forgiveness afterward. And that's sort of the hallmark version of what it was supposed to be. And that wasn't it at all. It was very pragmatic. All the person had to do was tell exactly what they had done, names and places, every detail possible, and that they would never do something like that again. And what counted in particular as brownie points is if one of those people came up and not only said, yeah, you always suspected I was the killer of that activist. Yeah, I was the one who did it. This is what, for them to say, and you never even found this one. I also killed that person. If they were willing to do that, they didn't have to apologize. They didn't have to express remorse. They didn't have to make eye contact with the family members. All they needed to do was that. And only a small number of the architects and agents of apartheid chose to go through this process, and only a subset of them wound up being given amnesty by the Truth and Reconciliation courts. But in general, there was a sense that some approximation of justice was done. The average South African, Black South African, felt that a good job had been done on this. Immediate family members of victims had more mixed opinions about it. Go figure, but overall it worked. Why was it done this way? Why wasn't there an attempt to get the sobbing ex-murderer and hugging the grandmother and all that? Why was this sufficient? For some very pragmatic reasons again. One of the key reasons why it was done was when you get like any police drama and you get like the poor lowest level street schnook who you arrest, who you're going to put away in the slammer forever until he implicates the guy one step up, and then get him under duress to implicate one step all the way up to the like boss of boss ways up on top. And that was the same strategy here. Each one of them to say, who gave you the orders? Who gave you the orders all the way up, so that eventually it is absolutely irrefutably in the record, this was the government. This was government policy. Never was there going to be some nauseating Holocaust denier equivalent of saying this was never a national policy. These were lone wolves who went rogue or whatever. Here was the hierarchy of commands. That was one thing they want out of it. The other was South Africa was a total mess at this point. Quite reasonably, lots of the Black African population had a whole lot of vengeance in their blood over what had been done to them for decades and decades. There was a whole Afrikaans white militia of tens of thousands of armed farmers up at some corner there, ready to go to battle to try to overthrow Mandela's government when they got the word. This was the pragmatic solution. Just get through this, get everyone who might lead a vigilante squad to kill one of these people to also say they were not going to do it. And nobody has to say they're sorry. Just don't do it again. And now we know who did what to who, and we can go about rebuilding the country. And I think that, that's the closest approximation of what has worked in the aftermath of a lot of these. And perhaps that's the path that Syria should take at this point.
Our final question is: are the anatomical and physiological changes in the amygdala in response to chronic stress reversible? How can we address this Syrian national problem?
Well, let me take that other question from a recently liberated Syrian and put it in a larger scope. And if okay, I will paraphrase that as what happens to us now? How screwed up are we in Syria? How screwed up have we been after 53 years of this terror? And very similar questions being asked by people in recent years in Ukraine. What is this doing to us if we happen to come out with our own country at the other end of this? What are the effects of this? How screwed are we? What is reversible? What can we expect to heal? Just how much trauma is it possible for society to take? And this is very apt, given that just a few episodes ago, we were talking about the multi-generational mechanisms for epigenetic transmission of trauma, things of that sort. And this is exactly the arena where this is going on. And just to give a slight feel for what we're dealing with here, what does the literature show? Women who undergo trauma while they are pregnant, death of a loved one, environmental disaster, assault, any such, the whole array of those. And what are the consequences for the offspring thanks to epigenetic changes that are now well understood? An increased risk of depression in the fetus once they become an adult, of anxiety disorders, of substance abuse, of ADHD, of antisocial behavior, of impulse control problems, of cognitive problems, and all sorts of health. Yeah. And this has now been happening to this whole society for 53 years or so. What you see is in the case of PTSD, the formal version, I've never heard somebody in that business talk about how PTSD can be cured. They talk about how people could learn to contain it, to be able to surf on the top of it and survive it and all of that. But amid sort of those pictures, one of the theme that came out in this episode a few back is epigenetic changes, changes in gene regulation, thanks to things like trauma. They can be lifelong, and here are mechanisms by which they could be multi-generational. And those studies showing epigenetic changes in grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, amid that picture of what the next umpteen generations might be like for the people of Syria, a key thing is the epigenetic changes, the consequences of trauma are not necessarily permanent. The molecular mechanisms are reversible to some extent. And it comes with a proviso, which I had noted the other week, which is, yeah, it's potentially reversible. The longer you wait, the harder it's going to be. The older the person, the harder it's going to be, which gives somewhat of a sort of blueprint for how to approach the individuals who have been traumatized by this. How do you approach an entire society that has been broken by this? And there's every reason to think that Syria now is the epitome of what would be thought of as a society with very low social capital. That's the jargon, social capital. How much trust do people have in each other? And even though Syria under the Assads was not one of those like East Germany with the Stasi, where every person was informing on every other person, apparently that was not the case here, mainly because it was the ethnic Alawites who were ruling everyone else. So it was not all that easy to make everyone else an informant on their neighbor and cousin and niece. But nonetheless, a society with very little trust, and the other building block of low social capital, no sense of efficacy. Yeah, you complain about some injustice and they drop poison gas on you. That really robs you of a sense of efficacy. And what you have a society that has spent that many years with its social capital just plundered in these sorts of ways. And you are left with a very broken, sick society. I saw a remarkable example of that when I was 21 and young and stupid towards the end of my first year in Africa with my baboons. Uganda next door got into a war with Tanzania next door. Uganda invaded and seized a small part of Tanzania. Uganda under controlled the famed dictatorial lunatic Idi Amin, and Tanzania counterattacked and blew away the Ugandan army and overthrew Amin, who led the country with his immediate followers, and Tanzania liberated the country. And I went to the capital of Uganda, Kampala, a few days after it was liberated because I was a stupid 21-year-old who thought this would be interesting to see. And this was a country broken by Idi Amin, predominantly an outside ethnic group minority that had the guns and the keys to the prisons and the torture chambers. And this was a society shattered by this. And I was walking around Kampala one of those days where what most people were doing were going out trying to find food because everything had collapsed there. And the most amazing manifestation of a sick society, and that, I was walking along, there was a bunch of people, and presumably someone somewhere out on one of these streets had to stop and tie their shoe, or they had dropped their bag of onions and potatoes and were leaning down to gather it up. And as a result, the people around them stopped. And as a result, the people around them must have stopped. And as a result, the people 3 rows out must have said, uh-oh, nobody's moving. Something's wrong. And everybody, the entire like town square there of Kampala, everyone stopped, standing there saying, what's happening? What's wrong? What's wrong? And everybody stood there frozen, and it felt like 30 minutes, but it might have been 30 seconds until some Tanzanian soldiers came along and yelled at everyone to get going. But this is what a broken society looks like, where somebody stopping to tie their shoe ripples outward of, oh my God, what's wrong? Freeze, figure out what direction you're going to run, if there is any direction to run. So, on every possible level, literal or metaphorical, that's probably where Syria is at this point. They've got two things going for them. The first one is a fair amount of social cohesion. People there are mainly Sunni Muslim, and they have been suffering under this small outgroup that has been dominating them. They have social support. They have traditional village life. They have extended families. They've got all that stuff where rather than feeling like there's something wrong with you if you're living with your parents when you're 21, instead of showing your independence, cohesive family units, multi-generational, blah, 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 all of that. And that's going to be enormously hopeful and helpful. The other reason is that Syria has spent the better part of a decade coming apart as a result of the Arab Spring, trying to overthrow this dictator. And it led to this horrendous civil war that killed tens of thousands of civilians, again with poison gas, led to like half of Syria being refugees now, all of that catastrophic. But what has just happened is they won. All of this was for a reason. It took forever. The cost was incalculable, but at least this was for a reason. We won. And that's got to be protective at this point also. What is going to happen to Syria now? What factional jockeying? What new forms of like bloodshed and new, warlords and death squads and who knows what else may emerge, or what may emerge is finally a free, stable country one may hope for. But at least right at this juncture, that's one of the things that has to help this society heal, but it's got a hell of a lot to heal from. So good luck to the newly freed people of Syria, and I hope it remains that way.
And that's episode 43. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.